Hello everyone and welcome to your second week of lab for Health 318 Applied Epidemiology. In this video, I'm going to provide just some basic instructions for the lab, specifically because Monday is a holiday, and so we will follow a Monday schedule on Tuesday, and therefore the Tuesday lab will not meet in person. For those of you in the Tuesday lab, I'm sorry, but you will have to complete that lab on your own, but the good news is you have all week to do that. Your lab assignment for those in the Tuesday lab is going to be Friday at 4 o'clock. So please make sure to watch this video. I will provide some detailed instructions on what you need to do for lab, and also it will give you enough time working on it all week. If you have any questions, you can stop by your lab instructor's office hours. So for this week, what you're going to be doing is kind of two things. You're going to complete a team contract with your group members. This basically will set out the expectations and lay them out very clearly for everyone in your group in terms of what you expect from one another throughout the quarter, working together on your team project. And then you are going to complete a lab assignment that's really going to focus on conducting a literature search on your given research question, which we will talk about in just a moment as well. Both of these items will be due on Friday at 4 p.m. So please make sure to submit both of those submissions on Canvas, and this is a group assignment. So there will be one team contract for each team, and then your week 2 lab assignment will be one submission for each team as well. In terms of the Canvas module for week 2 lab, I just want to point out a couple of things. You got your overview page right here. I'm going to go over in just a moment some slides. You can download those slides there for reference. The actual instructions for the lab you can download here as a Word document, and then you can upload your team contract here. If you click on this team contract submission, the actual team contract can be downloaded here as a Word document. Just so you see what this looks like, you're going to come up with a team name, you'll put the date. I want you to put your team's research question. Remember, this should include an independent and a dependent variable. You'll put that in that box here. I want you to think about what your team's goals are for the quarter. So maybe you all want to get A's in this class. That would be a common goal that students typically have. But think about things that maybe you want to accomplish in terms of learning. Also, think about the expectations you have for one another. So if you need to meet outside of lab, for example, think about a specific time, maybe at least an hour, that works for everybody in your lab, and put down that time. If you do have meetings, think about how frequent those meetings are going to be. What are your expectations of each other in regards to attendance at those meetings? Any communication, how are you all going to communicate? Are you going to communicate via text, via email? Do you have expectations around how quickly you expect your teammates to respond to those messages? Things like that. The clearer you are now with each other, the better your experience will be throughout the quarter working as a team. I want you to think about what rules you can agree on to help meet your goals and your expectations that you've set out. So any rules for your group, maybe around being respectful, communication, think about anything that might be applicable to what you expect in terms of rules. And then I want you to think about if someone isn't performing in regards to the goals and the expectations that you've laid out in your contract, how are you going to deal with those? Are you going to deal with those amongst each other first, or are you going to go directly maybe to your instructor? I want you to think about what the process might look like if someone isn't meeting those expectations that you set as a team. At the end of this document, you should put each team member's name, and then you will save this and you will submit it to this team contract submission. The other thing you'll need to submit is your actual lab assignment, which I'm going to talk about now. So in the last few moments of this video, I just want to briefly go over your actual lab assignments. I'm going to briefly talk about primary versus secondary research sources because you are going to need to identify primary research, and I want to make sure you understand what that is. We're going to talk about sections of a research article and how to strategically read research articles. They can be really long, and so I want to just make some comments in terms of how you can be efficient at reading through articles. We're also going to briefly talk about references and bibliographies, and then also the actual lab assignment as well. So in terms of research articles that are out there, we refer to these either as primary or secondary research. So I want to kind of start with secondary research, specifically because the articles that you find for your lab assignment today, you're going to be conducting a literature review. So you're going to search the literature to find articles. You may not use secondary research for this assignment. What do I mean by secondary research? What we're referring to here are maybe like books that exist on a given topic. You cannot use books, but commonly what you'll find in things like PubMed or different health-related databases is you're going to find review articles. So things like a systematic review, a meta-analysis, some sort of narrative review. You might find things like editorials or commentaries. These are articles that essentially go in and they find a bunch of articles that have already been published and they review those articles. They talk about those articles and their findings. That is not original primary research. So for your lab assignment, you want to avoid picking any kind of secondary research article, especially things like systematic reviews. You'll know it's a review article because if you read the abstract, you read the text, it might be set up a little differently in terms of it doesn't have kind of the main sections we typically see. You'll also see that it talks about searching for articles and how they narrow down their search for articles. It should be pretty obvious that it is a review article. You want to stay away from those. What you want to focus on for your lab assignment is you're going to want to find primary research articles. These are original scientific reports of research. These are things like a cross-sectional study, a cohort study, any kind of just regular study design. As long as it's primary research, those authors went out and actually conducted a research study. That is what we're talking about in terms of primary research. You'll typically see things like an introduction, a methods section, the results section, discussion section, as well as a list of references. Again, those authors actually conducted a study. It is okay if the authors conducted a study using data that already exists. So some studies might do secondary data analyses where they maybe get data from the CDC and then they analyze that data and they write up the results. Secondary data can still be primary research. You just want to make sure you're picking a research paper that isn't reviewing existing articles on a topic. You want to make sure you're picking primary papers, research papers that they're literally conducting analyses and studies on a given topic that the authors are actually doing those studies. So in the next few slides, I want to briefly talk about the sections of a research article, because if you know where to find information, you'll get a lot more efficient at reading through articles because you'll know where to go to find the information that you need. So the introduction or the background is typically the first section you see in a research article. The way that these are structured is they start really broad and then they kind of narrow down in that section. And they basically end with the specific study that's being conducted. So they typically will describe the rationale for the study and why it is important. They'll talk about previous work. So they'll kind of highlight the work that's already been done in a given area. But what they do is they say, this study and this study and this study, these all examined this maybe in a specific population or maybe at a specific time period. But given what we know in the introduction, we then really highlight given that these previous studies have been done, here's what we still don't know. Here is the gap in knowledge. And they really do a good job of identifying that gap in knowledge and making the case for why this particular study, why do we care? Why is it important? And then the introduction, you'll typically find in like the last few sentences of that introduction, you'll find the actual purpose of the study and the hypothesis that the authors have. So a lot of studies will say towards the very end of that introduction section, the purpose of this study is to, or the aim of this study is to, and then sometimes the authors will provide their hypothesis. Here's an example introduction from a research article. And the way that this is structured is basically we're kind of funneling down. We're starting off really, really broad, and then we're getting more narrow and specific in our information. So we start off talking about people of Chinese origin represent the largest group of Asian Americans. We then kind of funnel down further into breast cancer is the most common cancer in U.S. Chinese women and increasing in incidence. So we kind of start off in the larger population, then we get more narrow in terms of talking about breast cancer. And then we talk about the role of inflammation and how that might contribute to increased risk. So we're still funneling down. And then in the very last part of this introduction, the authors state their objective. They say the objective of this study was to examine associations of inflammatory markers with breast density among female Chinese immigrants and to explore whether associations varied by neighborhood environment. And then they actually include their hypothesis in here as well, but you can see how it starts off really broad, and then by the end of that introduction, you should clearly be able to see the purpose or the objective of that study. In the next section, you'll find the methods. This typically will, usually it will say the type of study. So it'll say it was a cross-sectional study or a cohort study. It usually will give you the study design. They'll talk about the participants. So who was actually, who did they try to recruit for the study and who was actually recruited and sampled, included in that sample. How did they do that? So what was the sampling technique that they used? They'll talk about their eligibility criteria. So who was actually eligible to be a part of that study, geographically, where did the study take place? And then this is also typically where they might mention information on informed consent. Besides the participants, this is also where you're going to find information on the variables that were included in the study. And so this is an important piece of the methods section. They will typically describe both their independent as well as their dependent variables and how they measured those in a study. So maybe they say that sleep quantity or quality were their independent variables. And then in that methods section, they're going to talk about how they measured sleep. So maybe they use the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index in order to measure sleep, and they'll talk about how they coded that data for their analysis. They'll also talk about their procedures for data collection, so how they actually collected the data, and then they'll also talk about their statistical analysis. So they'll actually say, for example, we conducted a logistic regression to look at the relationship between sleep quality and level and stress, being maybe high or low stress. They'll also talk about any confounders that they considered as well in that analysis. Moving on to the results, this is literally where the results are described. We typically, in articles, we see that they start off talking about the characteristics of the participants. So we typically describe the people in our study and what that looked like first off. And then we talk about the main findings. We start with what that main primary outcome was that we were looking at. So you should be able to see that in the results. You can look specifically at the tables and figures in the paper to start with if you're trying to find the results of a study. And then you can actually go back and look at the results section to see what the authors say. But those tables and figures can be really helpful if you're trying to skim through an article and you just want to see kind of the main findings. You can also look at those tables and figures. In the discussion section, you'll typically see that the authors just start off with kind of a high-level summary of what they found, and then they typically talk about those findings in the context of previous work that's been done, and how that fits into that that scientific area. They also talk about the strengths and limitations of a study. So maybe strengths included something like a large sample size, but they might also talk about those limitations as well. And then they'll have some concluding statements about maybe what future research should look like. This slide has this kind of schematic visual to provide some recommendation in terms of how to read articles. What I recommend is to focus on the specific section in which you're going to find the information that you need. So let's say that you need to figure out what variables they included in terms of their independent variable or variables and their dependent variable or variables. And I need to know how they measured those variables. I'm going to go to the methods section to find that. Or if I want to know what the purpose of a research article was, I'm going to go to the bottom of the introduction section to find that information. So I recommend you can skim the article. It's always a good idea to start with the abstract, but pull up the actual article, skim it, and go to the sections where you know you're going to find the information that you need for whatever it is that you're doing. You will need to include citations for your lab assignment and your final paper for lab. You'll have in-text citations as well as a bibliography or reference list. This OWL Purdue is really the best resource for writing in APA format. You can click there and they have information on how to cite all kinds of things, including articles, websites, all kinds of things. So definitely check that OWL Purdue out. Some tips for finding articles. You can search by specific study designs if that's something that you're interested in doing. I would use different search terms that are relevant to your research question. You might need to try different spellings of different terms. If you're having issues with search terms, please let your instructor know. Other strategies, you can, if you find one article that's really great and matches your research question, look at the reference list in that article. Chances are you're going to find other articles that might be relevant to your research question. Also, you can look at a systematic review as a starting point. You cannot use a systematic review for your assignment, but you can start with a systematic review because a systematic review essentially is reviewing all of the relevant papers that are out there on a given topic. So you can look at that systematic review, go to their references and see all of the papers that they have referred to, and those papers might be primary research articles that would be relevant for your research question. So they can be a nice starting place, but again, you cannot include systematic reviews for your assignment. I want to point out that not all articles are created equal. Some articles are written really well. They're easy to read. It's easy to find information. If you're really struggling to find the information you need in an article, pick a new one. There's going to be information and articles out there that will be relevant to your research question. Don't feel like you're stuck with an article just because you pulled it up in PubMed. For your lab assignment, there's two parts. The first part is a literature search tutorial through the Cal Poly library, and then you're actually going to conduct a literature search on your research question. So for the first part of this assignment, you're going to complete the Research 101 tutorial through the Cal Poly library. To do that, you'll click on this link here, which is in the PDF of the slides. It's also in the instructional handout on Canvas. When you start this tutorial, you're going to put your name in the box there, and then you can click next. You are going to complete this finding sources section. So you don't need to worry about the other ones. You can just work on that finding sources. You'll get to the find sources page and you can click through. You'll complete the OneSearch, library databases, and search techniques. You do not need to complete the locate books in Kennedy Library. Whatever your end screen after you do complete that tutorial looks like. It might look different for you. Whatever it does look like, just take a screenshot of it and put your name on it. I know some students have said, well, mine doesn't look like this. It looks a little bit different. Whatever yours looks like is fine. Just make sure that you put your name on it, and all members of the group should put that in your submission. So in the second part of lab, once you finish that tutorial, you are going to conduct a literature search for your research question. So you might be wondering, why do we do this? Why is this the first step in our process? Why can't we just jump into our research? There's several reasons why it's really important to do a literature review first. We need to know what is already known about a given topic. So we want to avoid duplicating studies that have already been done. We also need to identify the gap in knowledge. What is the gap in the literature that needs to be filled? It also helps in us understand how we are going to conduct our study. So if we're going to measure stress, for example, stress is something that's very difficult to measure. We have to figure out how we're actually going to measure stress. So we're going to look at the existing research and see, how do those studies measure stress? Is there a validated scale or some sort of instrument that we commonly use to assess stress? That's information that we can get from those existing studies. Maybe there's a set of questions that are typically used in the literature. But we need this information to describe the literature, typically in the background or introduction section of our manuscripts. So for this lab assignment, each team needs to identify at least 4 studies. So you're going to search the literature, you're going to find studies that are relevant to your research question. Remember, these have to be primary research. They need to be observational studies. So think about things like cross-sectional studies, case control studies, cohort studies. Remember things like systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Those are considered secondary research, and you should not include those in your lab assignment. So you need to identify 4 studies, and all 4 studies that you identify, they need to include measures of either your independent or your dependent variable. Ideally, they should have both. So let's say that I'm looking at caffeine consumption and GPA, then I would want to have studies that look at caffeine consumption, my independent variable. Maybe they look at a different dependent variable. And then I find studies that look at GPA and how that's measured. But ideally, I would find 4 studies that look at both caffeine consumption and GPA. You should, at a minimum, have at least 2 articles that inform the measurement of your independent variable. So at least 2 articles that tell you how to measure caffeine consumption, at least 2 articles that inform your measurement of your dependent variable. So at least 2 articles that tell you how to measure GPA. And at least one of the articles should closely match your same independent and dependent variable. Ideally, all 4 of your articles would match both in terms of independent and dependent variables, but it may not be feasible to find 4 articles, but you do need at least 1. Ideally, if you can get more than that, that would be great. But the purpose of this is you are trying to figure out how you are going to measure your variables in your study. So you're reviewing the existing literature on a topic, and you are saying, oh, it appears from all these articles that we measure sleep quality by using the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, right? These articles are going to help you figure out how you're actually going to operationalize, how you're actually going to measure variables in your study. So for the lab submission, you do need to have those screenshots for every single member in your team. Please make sure you put the individual team member's name and then the screenshots right below it so it's clear whose screenshot is included. You need to have citations for all of the articles in APA format. So again, please refer to OWL Purdue if you need any clarification on how to write citations in APA format. There are very clear instructions in there. In the next part of the lab, you're going to choose one of the article that closely matches what you are investigating. So hopefully it has the same independent and dependent variable, and then you're going to answer some questions. So think about, how did the authors make the case for the need for the study? Why is the topic important, and what is the knowledge gap being filled? This should really just be 1 to 2 sentences. Question 2, what is the main research question and what hypothesis is being tested? Remember, you're going to find this information probably at the bottom of the introduction section. You'll need to state the study design that is being used. Question 4, who and how many subjects were included in the study? How were they selected and where did the study take place? Question 5, what were the main findings? Were their hypotheses supported by the data, and what did the authors conclude? And then question 6, what are some limitations of the study? Any particular strengths? And then in part D, for all 4 of the articles, you need to answer what are the main independent and dependent variables. For each variable that's relevant for your research question, you need to talk about how it was measured. So is there a specific instrument or questionnaire that was used? So if I'm looking at a paper that looked at sleep quality as one of their variables, it's likely that they use the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. So I would state that they use the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index to measure sleep quality. It may not be that they used a specific instrument. If they didn't, what specific questions did they ask to measure those variables of interest? What were the options that were given? In terms of options given, we're talking about what were the possible responses that the participants could have provided when answering that question. And then part 3, what did the authors report about the reliability and validity of their measure? They might specifically talk about the fact that they used an existing instrument or scale that has been used before, and they might talk about the reliability and the validity of the measure. It's also possible that the authors did not talk about the reliability and the validity of the measure. And so if they didn't talk about that, you would want to discuss that in your response to question 3. And then part E, in 1 to 2 paragraphs, I want you to describe the main things that you learned about the methods and procedures from the studies, and talk about how you're going to use the information from these studies that you found to collect your data. So more specifically, I want you to think about if you're going to use the same instrument or questions that they use to measure your variables. So for example, let's say that I was looking at sleep quantity, and I was looking at the relationship between sleep quantity and exercise. I would say that I would use the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index because that's the way that sleep was measured in all these studies that I found. I would use that instrument. However, maybe I'm just going to choose a few questions from that instrument because I don't need the entire thing for what it is I'm trying to measure about sleep. Ideally, you should be using questions and instruments from existing studies. It is not scientifically appropriate to make up questions, especially if there's validated questions or instruments that already exist. Remember, this is a group assignment, so please submit one document as a group. Make sure you've got all the screenshots for everybody in there, and you've got all the responses to all of the questions in the lab instructional handout. This assignment should be turned in by Friday at 4 o'clock for those in the Tuesday lab. And if you're in the Friday lab, hopefully you will finish this assignment by the end of lab. If you have any questions, please make sure to reach out to your lab instructor.